Now, as Paul goes on and talks about the qualifications for elders, the next one is related to some other things we've talked about. We've talked about being temperate. We've talked about being sensible or sober-minded. Well, that was one's character, and this here really puts that into practice, where he says very specifically he is not addicted to wine. Now, the New American Standard that we're using here for our study, it says not addicted to wine, which makes us think of an addiction to it. But really what this Greek word means is that he is not given to wine, which is the King James version of this. So it's related to what we talked about with being temperate there in verse 2, where, as we notice with that word, it means to abstain from wine. But as we talked about that, it really is talking about the principle of that he must be able to think clearly and not allow anything to hinder his focus on the work that he is doing. We talked about the word prudent, which the King James translates as sober. He needs to be sober-minded, that he is not giving himself over to things that are going to hinder his work. Well, here specifically, he talks about alcohol. And this is a controversial one, because there are a lot of people who think that drunkenness is wrong, but as long as you don't proceed to drunkenness, then that's okay. However, this is not talking about drunkenness. One can be impacted by alcohol without ever getting drunk on that alcohol. It can still affect his thinking. It can still hurt his influence if we want to talk about it from that angle. But as far as his ability to carry out this work, it can hinder him even if he never proceeds to drunkenness. And so the elder in the local church, in order to be qualified, he's not to give himself over to this. And then the next thing he mentions, which in some ways could be related to that not addicted to wine, because of so often what it leads to, especially if it does proceed to drunkenness, he says that he is not to be pugnacious, or that he is no striker, as the King James Version says. Now, this is not directly related to the previous qualification of not addicted to wine, but there is a connection when you think about those ideas. One is where he is giving himself over to something that could let him or allow him to lose control of his senses. And here he is not acting with self-control, and he is then becoming a striker, or the idea of being quarrelsome, that he is a fighter or a brawler, that this is what he has given himself to do. Now, as we've already talked about, when Paul told Timothy that the elder is to be able to teach, part of that, as we notice in Titus 1 and verse 9, is that he is to refute those who contradict. So when you have false teachers, he has to be willing to stand up to them and refute what they are teaching. So when he does that, though, he is not to be pugnacious, not to be a striker, not to be quarrelsome, which means that he is to refute their teaching, but do so honorably. We are to be bold in our defense of what is true. The elder is to be the same. But boldness does not require an argumentative demeanor. He is to refute those who contradict, but he is not to go down this path where he is quarrelsome, where he is a hothead, where he lets himself get out of control. He is to remain in control while he carries out his work, even refuting those who contradict. Then Paul says that the elder is to be gentle. This is the opposite of what we just saw. He is not pugnacious, not a striker. Instead, he is to be gentle. He is to conduct himself in such a way and interact with others in the church that he is striving to maintain unity in the body. He is not doing anything that will disrupt the unity in the local church. And then the next one goes right along with that he is to be peaceable. King James, as we've already mentioned this term already when we talked about he's not a striker or not pugnacious, the King James says he is not a brawler. He is to, again, refute those who contradict. He is to do, as Paul told Timothy in 1 Timothy 6 and verse 12, to fight the good fight of faith. But he is not to go beyond that. He's not going to fight for his opinions. He's not going to fight in a way that pits one person against another and is arguing over personalities or personal preferences. He's fighting the good fight, but he's not fighting beyond that. He's trying to keep everyone together, keep everyone united as they follow the truth. He is striving for everyone to be at peace with one another, and he is, through his conduct, working to facilitate that. And then the final one of these character qualifications in this section is that Paul says that he is to be free from the love of money. And the King James uses the term not covetous. The reason why covetousness is to be avoided, why an elder cannot be covetous, is because this is a form of idolatry. Colossians 3 and verse 5 says, "Therefore consider the members of your earthly body as dead to immorality, impurity, passion, evil desire, and greed," or covetousness. And Paul says that this amounts to idolatry. So he is not to be covetous. He's to be free from the love of money. And this is particularly important for the elders. I mean, obviously all Christians need to be free from the love of money. Paul is going to say later in this letter that the love of money is the root of all sorts of evil. But it's especially important for the elders, because the elders are going to be responsible for whatever funds are collected by the church. Over in Acts chapter 11, when the church at Antioch sent funds to help with needy saints in Judea, they sent it by Barnabas and Saul. And it says in Acts 11 and verse 30, they sent it in charge of Barnabas and Saul to the elders. So the elders were going to be receiving these funds, and they would also, when the church takes up a collection on the first day of the week, as 1 Corinthians 16 talks about, it would be the same thing. But they are the ones who would have access to and would be in charge of the funds of the congregation. If they do not meet this characteristic, where they are free from the love of money, then there is going to be a great temptation for them to act in an improper way toward the money that is collected. And there have been examples in the Lord's church and in other religious bodies where those who had access to the money that the church has collected use that in improper ways for their own benefit. So those who are elders in the church, they have to be free from the love of money. Then Paul is going to continue with some more qualifications for elders in verses 4 through 7. He says, "He must be one who manages his own household well, keeping his children under control with all dignity. But if a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? And not a new convert, so that he will not become conceited and fall into the condemnation incurred by the devil. And he must have a good reputation with those outside the church, so that he will not fall into reproach and the snare of the devil." So as Paul goes into some more qualifications for elders, he says that he is to manage his own household well. As God has ordered and arranged the family relationship, he has put husbands as being the head of the household. Over in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 23, it says, "For the husband is the head of the wife, as Christ also is the head of the church, he himself being the Savior of the body." So the husband is the head of the wife, head of the household, and this is preparing him for the eldership, that he would have oversight of the congregation, that he is leading the congregation. And again, not leading in such a way that he is lording it over them, as we've already mentioned, 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 3. He's not doing it for his own selfish benefit. He's doing this for the good of the congregation, but he has to lead and oversee the church. And so he has to have proved his ability to do this, and he does that by managing his own household well. So what does that mean? Well, he says he keeps his children under control with all dignity. When his children are under control, this means that they obey and respect him. Now, there is a question on this. Does this mean that they are to be faithful to him or to be faithful Christians? Titus 1 and verse 6, in the parallel passage, says that the children are to be faithful or children who believe. And there's a question, does that mean they're faithful to their father or faithful to the Lord? It means that they're faithful to the Lord. And we'll go into that more when we get to Titus chapter 1 and look at those qualifications. But even here in this passage, where it's not quite as clear, but the context still indicates that these children are to be Christians. How do we know that his children are to be Christians? If his children are under control, with all dignity, he's managing his own household. What is there in this passage that would indicate that they are Christians? Well, notice what Paul says. If a man does not know how to manage his own household, how will he take care of the church of God? The way that he manages his household and the way that his children behave are proof that he can oversee the church. That's what Paul says here. That the way that he conducts himself, the way that his children are conducting themselves, will demonstrate that he is able to oversee the church or take care of the church of God. So his children are proof of this. Well, in what way do they prove this? If he's overseeing the church just as he is overseeing his children, what is he overseeing them to do? He is overseeing the church to be faithful in their service to the Lord. Many fathers have children who respect them and obey them, but have no interest in spiritual things. Well, that's not what an elder is to be. An elder is leading the church not just to be good people, not just to be people who get along with one another or are respectable and good citizens. No, he's leading them to be faithful Christians. And the behavior of his children demonstrates that he is able to do this. He's able to lead them in this way. So this is more than just, well, they're well behaved. It means they are spiritually focused, where they are faithful followers of the Lord. He has proven that in the way that he has managed his household in leading his children to do this, that he can take care of the church of God to lead the members of that church to also faithfully follow the Lord. But then he goes on and says that he is not to be a new convert. Now, in one sense, we could say this is just practical, that a new convert is not going to be qualified. And that's true. But another way that we can look at this is that he needs time to grow. And ideally, he would have time where he was being led by other men who were serving as elders and could learn from them. Now, that doesn't mean if one is never in a congregation with elders that he couldn't be qualified. That's not the point. But he is learning from others. He is developing his faith. He is developing his character. So he cannot be a new convert. And then Paul says that he is to have a good reputation with those who are outside the church. Now, his point here does not mean that any accusation, even a false accusation by someone outside the church, would disqualify someone from being an elder. That's not his point. But instead, in order to have a good reputation, he would have to consistently do good so that others could see this, so that he builds his reputation in that way. This is not just for those who are in the church, but also for those who are outside of the church. So whether he is around Christians or non-Christians, he is to consistently do good and show himself a man of character so that he can develop this good reputation. So he is to be the same whether he is with Christians or with people in the world. He is to demonstrate to everyone what a Christian ought to be.